Welcome to Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the remains of Congolese icon and the country's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, are laid to rest in Kinshasa before thousands of people who turn out for the spectacular procession. Belgium returned a single tooth from the murdered independence hero earlier this month. Also, the pandemic has had a devastating effect on learning across Africa and in developing countries around the world. School closures have excluded the most vulnerable, led to a spike in teen pregnancies, and hit the mental health of both children and teachers hard. And the campaign for legislative and local elections has kicked off in Congo, Brazzaville. Thousands of candidates are in the running, but several opposition parties are boycotting the polls, saying the outcome's a foregone conclusion. But first, he paid the ultimate price for fighting oppression. After 10 days of nationwide commemorations on the 62nd anniversary of DR Congo's independence and more than 61 years after his death, the remains of Patrice Lumumba were buried in Kinshasa on Thursday. Belgium finally handed over the tooth of the assassinated Congolese Prime Minister to his family earlier this month. It had been taken as a grim trophy by a Belgian police commissioner. Our correspondent Clément Bonnereau reports.
I'm on the Exchange Square in Limete, in the heart of Kinshasa, DR Congo's capital. It is here in this mausoleum behind me where Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first Prime Minister, was buried on Thursday. President Félix Tshisekedi and President Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo Brazzaville attended the ceremony alongside Lumumba's family members, his children and his grandchildren who followed the coffin all the way from Belgium and across the Congo.
In our culture, the Bantu culture, it is very important that the body can be buried according to our own customs. So there was something very spiritual about this ceremony. And I also think that the people were expecting it. Wherever we went, Congolese people were waiting for us. They welcomed us. They put aside their tribal and their political differences to get together. And so we can see that Patrice Emery Lumumba remains a unifying figure more than ever.
Speaking for the first time since Belgium returned Lumumba's remains to his family earlier this month, President Félix Tshisekedi held this ceremony as a historic moment for the country, a view shared by many Congolese people.
It brings us great joy. We're here and we're celebrating. It's also a historic moment for us, for our children and grandchildren. Up until now, we didn't know where Lumumba was, and now we can see his coffin.
Today, given that Lumumba has returned to the land of his ancestors, we need to come together and make his dreams come true. He was a fierce advocate of national unity, because without national unity, the Congo would collapse.
More than 61 years after his death, DR Congo's independence hero can finally rest in the land of his ancestors. But the exact circumstances of his killing remain unclear to this day. Belgium admitted its moral responsibility in the early 2000s, but stopped short of naming those responsible, and no one has ever been convicted.
Clément Bonnereau there for us. Now, in Sudan, 6 protesters were shot dead on Thursday in a crackdown on some of the largest protests against the country's military leaders this year. Internet and phone services were cut and key bridges were shut down to hamper the rallies. Tens of thousands of people turned out in Omdurman, Bari and Khartoum on the 3rd anniversary of the demonstrations that led to the ousting of former leader Omar al-Bashir. That then saw the army turn against the civilian elements of a transitional government last October. And at least 30 people were killed in Nigeria's Niger state after gunmen raided a mining site. Several workers, including 4 Chinese nationals, were abducted. The company is the latest to be targeted in escalating attacks and kidnappings for ransom. Samuel Okoye talks us through.
About 300 gunmen were said to have carried out the attack at the Chinese-run mining camp in Ajata Aboki village in Niger State. A coalition of civil society groups which document insecurity in the area said more than 30 security personnel made up of 7 policemen and 25 soldiers were killed during the attack. The group, the Coalition of Shiroro Associations, said majority of the dead soldiers were killed in an ambush when they responded to the attack on the mining camp. An unspecified number of civilians were also killed, while many people, including security personnel, are in hospital following injuries sustained during the attack. 4 Chinese and several other workers were abducted from the mining camp. the Niger State government blamed the attack on terrorists. Armed groups known as bandits operate in the area and several other parts of Nigeria. The armed groups, which the Nigerian government has designated as terrorists, have been carrying out vicious attacks to kill and to abduct people for ransom in several parts of Nigeria. This recent attack comes just days after the government of nearby Zamfara State asked the citizens to take up arms because security agents can no longer protect them from the bandits.
Sam Olokoya there for us in Lagos. Now, African ministers of education were in Paris on Thursday for a UNESCO summit on tackling the devastating effect that the pandemic has had on learning. 80 education chiefs from lower income nations, of which 49 were African, declared their commitment to overhauling education systems. Developing countries in particular have faced a slide in schooling because of COVID-19 restrictions. States facing climate crises or conflict are even more hard-pressed. About 40% of low-income countries have rolled back spending on education since 2020, and the impact of all of that inevitably ripples out to affect social and economic development, gender equality, and even security. So I'm joined now by Charles North, the head of the Global Partnership for Education that helped orchestrate that declaration from education ministers. Charles, thanks so much for coming in to speak to me. I know it's been some pretty intense conversations at that summit. But first of all, when it comes to this statement, why is it important and what's it likely to change?
So this statement was critical to enable these ministers to have a voice in the proceedings. Now, the people who came together, they represent 80 different countries. And of those countries, 50 are in Africa. But in total, the 80 countries represent 650 school-age children. So it's a very large group of people.
650?
650 million children, yeah. So all these countries have been facing severe blows from the pandemic, as you were mentioning, but also the triple whammy of fuel and food and climate change crises. And so it's in that context that these ministers were saying, we want to transform our education systems. And we're calling on increased budgets from our own countries, but we're also looking to the international community to step up their assistance in line with the priorities of government.
And when it comes to Africa, how did the pandemic specifically affect education on the continent?
So it was devastating to the continent, and it affected children across the continent. Excuse me. I'll give an example. When I was in Kenya last month, I talked to a principal who talked about the children who didn't come back and the teachers who passed away. That school was suffering. Now you replicate that across the entire continent, and the impact is tremendous. So before the pandemic, we were looking at about 250 million children were out of school. So this is very serious. But now we're seeing an additional 24 million children who will never go back. And most of those are girls because they've been either married or gotten pregnant or they had to work to help their families.
And you actually mentioned a really interesting number about the massive explosion in children leaving school who no longer are capable of being able to follow a simple written story.
So even those who came back to school, we're seeing significant loss in learning. Mm-hmm. So before the pandemic, we were looking at 57% of children at age 10 being unable to read and comprehend a simple story. Since then, now at this point in the pandemic, we're seeing that number rising to 70%. Wow. So you're almost getting to the point of saying, are children learning anything at all? And did they lose all that learning over the last 2 years? So that's very severe.
And you've characterized this as being learning poverty. Yes. And what in the long term does that mean for Africa? What does it cost the continent?
Well, you think about the fact children around the world and caught up in this pandemic, their lost lifetime earnings total $21 trillion. And even last year, the estimate was 17 trillion. So we're seeing it's actually getting worse in terms of the projections. Now, that's going to hit African countries very hard. Mm-hmm. And it's going to hit every sector of the economy. Think about it in health and security, as well as in the economies. And those countries are going to continue to be dependent on external advice and technical assistance because their own workforce is missed out on so much learning.
And what's the GPE doing to try and kind of mitigate some of the damage that's done quickly?
So GPE focuses on transformation of education systems. We work with governments. They lead the process with all the development partners, such as civil society, teachers, and so forth, to identify the critical issue, the critical bottleneck to education in those countries. And then we put all our resources and pull out resources from others to direct against that bottleneck so we can see impact at scale. So that way we can transform those education systems and enable every child to get a quality education, and particularly the most vulnerable children. Those, if we have to reach those vulnerable children, if we really want the transformation to happen.
Thank you so much, Charles North, there from the Global Partnership for Education. Well, in Congo-Brazzaville, the campaign for legislative and local elections has kicked off. More than 2,000 candidates are in the running for 151 seats in the country's lower house of parliament. But several opposition parties are boycotting the polls, saying that they are rigged. Rosie Piotr reports.
Looking confident, flanked by dozens of supporters, Feriol Gassakis is on his way to launch his campaign. He's running in the legislative elections for the ruling Congolese Labour Party in central Brazzaville. He thinks victory is a foregone conclusion.
Poto Poto is a stronghold of the Congolese Labour Party. We are quite the political machine, and you know, many people may not accept it, but we are the leading party in Congo. It's very difficult to beat us.
As in previous elections, several opposition parties are boycotting the vote. Jean-Jacques Yombi is the son of former President Joachim Yombi Opango and used to support President Denis Sassou Nguesso. He says the election will be neither free nor fair.
We thought that the minister in charge of organising the elections would level the playing field, but the system has prevented him from doing so. I am sad because we can't let this happen. When the Congolese people hit rock bottom, perhaps things will change. You can't cheat all the time.
Meanwhile, the campaign is sparking mixed reactions among voters, some saying the election is unlikely to make a difference at all.
I think voting is a right, and I'm planning to go to the polls, obviously, but maybe I'll just cast a blank vote.
As an observer, I will say that the empty chair policy is not a good policy. It doesn't always pay off. We have to move on. We have to deal with the system.
Security forces will be the first to cast their ballots on the 4th of July, ahead of the main vote on the 10th of July.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
In October 2018, escalating gas prices sparked a spontaneous protest movement called the Gilets Jaunes, Yellow Vests. Nearly 4 years after the initial protests, gatherings are still occurring under the same banner, but with much less impact. Vehemently anti-Macron, the Yellow Vests advocate for a better life for the working classes poor, but some of the protesters suffered great losses in the struggle. Revisiting the Gilets Jaunes, Yellow Vests, available on France 24 and France24.com. Versailles, Mont Saint-Michel, the Louvre are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs, meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You are here on France 24 and France24.com.